Yuta versus Mahoraga is one of those versus battles where when you initially think about it, you think it should be extremely close, and I did at first as well, until I thought heavily about this topic. And I do just want to say, out of all of the versus battles I've done, this topic, Yuta versus Mahoraga, is the one I've thought the most about, and I honestly do believe that although this fight has the potential to be close, I do think that Yuta would win in spectacular fashion. And although there are good arguments for both of these characters winning, I do think that the arguments for Yuta are more convincing and ultimately do lead to the conclusion of him winning. For this versus battle specifically, a lot of things in Jujutsu Kaisen need to be looked at in order to reach this conclusion. And although Yuta versus Mahoraga is a very complicated topic, we're going to take a deep dive into all of the things that make up this versus battle, the arguments for Mahoraga winning, the arguments for Yuta winning, and why in the end, I was wholly convinced that Yuta would beat Mahoraga and the fight would not be close. And in chapter 234, we saw Yuta say that he would be able to take on Mahoraga and Agito at the same time. And although these are just words here, for everything I'm about to tell you, I actually do think that Yuta would be able to do it. To set the scene, Yuta and Mahoraga will be fighting exactly where Sukuna fought Mahoraga on the street corner, but the Mahoraga in this fight will be the Mahoraga that Sukuna summoned. So it's not the one that Megumi summoned, it is the one from the entire fight of Sukuna versus Gojo. One more thing we need to cover about Mahoraga is that he will not in this fight be able to keep any of his past adaptations, as not only is that never stated in the manga, it's never implied either that Mahoraga keeps adaptations from the past times he was summoned. So in this fight with Yuta, he will be going into this fight fresh. He won't have automatically adapted to any of Yuta's curse techniques or anything like that. He will completely be anew. Anything he adapts to in this fight with Yuta, he will be able to keep, but no past adaptation. So for example, he did adapt to cleave in the fight with Sukuna, but he won't keep that adaptation here, as it is implied that Mahoraga has to completely start fresh every new time he's summoned, and it wouldn't even make sense if Mahoraga was able to keep adaptations from the past, as we know that a long time ago the Six Eyes and Ten Shadows head of the families fought each other, and although they fought then, Mahoraga's adaptation against Blue and Red in the fight against Gojo was completely at zero. He didn't keep any progress or any adaptations from the hundreds of years ago. He had to completely start again, and that is what will be happening in this fight with Yuta. Mahoraga will have no prior adaptations. He will just be as he was the first time we saw him against Sukuna, and then as Mahoraga fights Yuta, he will be able to adapt his attacks. But it is very important to note he will not be able to keep any past adaptations for this versus battle. And as for Yuta, he will start this battle like he usually starts fights, and that is without Rika summoned, but with the potential to summon her and put the ring on at any time he feels fit. So now that the stage is set, let's talk about the tools that each of these characters have in order to kill each other. And the first thing I think we need to talk about, which I believe is the most important part in determining the winner of this fight, is Yuta's domain expansion. If Yuta decides to put the ring on and open up a domain expansion, is Mahoraga immediately dead because of what we know about Yuta's domain? And I will also go over what would happen if Yuta did not use the domain expansion against Mahoraga, but I do think it is important to cover domain expansions first because I do think it is most likely that Yuta will use one in the fight against Mahoraga. There are two potential ways that Yuta has in order to kill Mahoraga if he were to open a domain expansion on him, and those two different ways is one, the cleave and dismantle that he copied from Sukuna, and two, the Angel's Curse technique. And the reason that I say that these are two ways that he would be able to kill Mahoraga is because we know that Yuta has the capability of applying any curse technique that he has copied to be the sure hit of his domain expansion. In the fight with Sukuna, it was the Angel's Curse technique, but in this fight with Mahoraga, it could either be cleave and dismantle or the Angel's Curse technique. It just depends on what Yuta chooses. So between these two curse techniques, let's see how they would interact if he were to use them on Mahoraga while Mahoraga is trapped inside his domain. Between the Shrine techniques and the Angel's Curse technique, I think that the Angel's technique would be better for getting rid of Mahoraga, but Shrine does have a good chance of deleting him as well, and I'll explain why. In the fight with Sukuna, we saw that whenever Sukuna used his domain expansion on Mahoraga, it completely evaporated him. it's easier to see what happens in the anime. In the manga, we see Mahoraga getting slashed a bunch of times, but in the anime, Mahoraga just completely disappears. We saw that in the anime, although Mahoraga was completely shredded to nothing, he was able to come back because he had already adapted to the slices. And this is very important to pinpoint. The only reason Mahoraga was able to come back after being hit by Sukuna's domain was because, as it says, he had already adapted to the slashes. This means if Sukuna had opened up his domain expansion at the beginning of the fight and completely destroyed Mahoraga as we saw him do later on, Mahoraga would have just died in that moment and never would have had a chance to adapt to the slashes. He would have gotten completely destroyed by Cleave and Dismantle and never would have regenerated if Sukuna had used his domain at the start. This is very important to go over because, as we know, Yuta is able to apply any curse technique he has to the sure hit of his domain expansion. So he could, if he wanted to, apply Cleave and Dismantle to the sure hit and hit Mahoraga with the same attack that he was dealt from Sukuna. And in theory, Yuta should be able to do the same thing Sukuna did when he opened up his domain expansion, and that would be to shred Mahoraga completely to nothing and not allow Mahoraga enough time to adapt to the slashes, thereby killing him. But there's only one problem with this theory. We don't actually know if Yuta's slashes inside of his domain expansion would be as powerful as Sukuna's, and if they would even be powerful enough to completely destroy Mahoraga to nothing like Sukuna did. We know that the strength of Shrine's slashes depend on your curse energy output into the curse technique. And not only does Sukuna have more curse energy than Yuta, but Kashima also notes that Sukuna's manipulation of curse energy is completely unreal. With an unreal level of curse energy manipulation and more curse energy to output than Yuta does, Sukuna's slashes are probably stronger than Yuta's are. Now here is the problem. We don't know exactly how much weaker Yuta's slashes are than Sukuna's. We do know that Sukuna's slashes were powerful enough to completely decimate Mahoraga, but we don't know if Yuta's meet the requirement in order to decimate Mahoraga as well. And the problem is, we don't know exactly how strong Yuta's slashes are because the only time we've seen him use them were on a weakened Sukuna. It is very possible that Yuta does have the strength to completely decimate Mahoraga in one go with a domain expansion, but because of the many unknowns when it comes to his strength of slashes versus Sukuna's, it wouldn't be right to say that just because Sukuna was able to decimate Mahoraga with a domain expansion and Shrine, Yuta would be able to do it as well. And another thing we don't know is if Yuta would be able to continuously rain down slashes in a domain expansion like Sukuna was able to. Because of these many unknowns, the strength of the slashes plus us not knowing how long Yuta can keep the slashes going, it just wouldn't be right to say that if Yuta opened up a domain and used Shrine, he would be able to kill Mahoraga. And as I said earlier, it is possible that Yuta would be able to kill Mahoraga with Shrine, but because of those unknowns, it just wouldn't be right to say that he definitely would be able to. The technique I think that would be most effective if applied to be the sure hit in Yuta's domain would be the Angel's Curse technique, but I'll get more into that in a second. We know that Yuta has access to a bunch of different curse techniques while he has his domain expansion active. He has the swords that are everywhere, and although he doesn't know which technique is in what sword just by looking at it, as soon as he grabs a sword, he knows which technique is in it. Most of Yuta's techniques I don't think would be effective at all against Mahoraga. For example, Curse Speech I don't see doing much of anything. Maybe he gets Mahoraga to stop moving for a moment, but even something like Mahoraga being still and Yuta stabbing him wouldn't really do that much. Drew Shikigami also shouldn't be that much of a threat to Mahoraga, as at most they seem like annoying distractions, as their primary use doesn't really seem like a damage technique but rather a diversion. One of the techniques that Yuta has that I think would be useful in the fight with Mahoraga, but not so much in killing him, would be the sky manipulation technique that he copied from Uro. We see that he is able to use Thin Icebreaker to knock Sukuna completely backwards, and he also used it in order to make Sukuna bleed. And although Thin Icebreaker does deal a decent amount of damage, it doesn't seem like it packs a big enough punch to completely kill Mahoraga if used against him. Because we know that attacks like Drew Shikigami or sky manipulation, if used repeatedly against Mahoraga, would just give him time to adapt to the techniques, and they eventually wouldn't be useful against him. We also saw that Yuta copied Charles' clairvoyance, and he was able to see 1 second into the future against Sukuna, but even in a fight against Mahoraga, at most this would just be prolonging the fight. Yes, it would allow him to get a hit or two on Mahoraga without him reacting, but at the end of the day, you need to take out Mahoraga in one big attack, or destroy him with enough small attacks before he can adapt, and so far, these techniques do not meet that criteria. There are only 2 techniques that do meet that criteria in the fight against Mahoraga. One was the shrine techniques that I already went over, and the other technique is the Angel's Jacob's Ladder. And I already went over why, although Shrine has the capability of destroying Mahoraga, given what we know about Yuta, it wouldn't be definitive to say that he would be able to destroy Mahoraga with Shrine, but I do think that the Angel's Curse technique would be able to do it. We know that Jacob's Ladder has 2 properties to the technique. The first property is that it destroys all evil that the light hits. We saw in the past that this proved extremely useful against Sukuna, as he was writhing in agony as it was dealing immense amount of damage to his body, but we don't actually even know if Mahoraga would be considered evil by Jacob's Ladder. There's no way for us to know whether the light would deem Mahoraga evil, bad, or neutral, so I think that the other property of the Angel's Light is what will be used to destroy Mahoraga, and that property is the extinguishment of curse techniques. If Yuta were to apply Jacob's Ladder to the sure hit of his domain expansion, I do think that it would be able to just completely delete Mahoraga, because Mahoraga is just an extension of the 10 Shadows technique. Mahoraga himself is one of the shadows. In chapter 251, we see the angel say that her technique is the eradication of its target's technique, and she also says that they should be able to destroy Sukuna with this technique because his incarnated form is a direct mix of Sukuna's technique himself, his personality, and the cursed object. Given that Mahoraga is a mix of the 10 Shadows technique and himself, he just directly is a shadow, the Angel's Light should just be able to completely eradicate him. The only way I see Mahoraga surviving this outcome is if he were able to kill Yuta or weaken him enough to where his domain goes away before he gets hit by the Angel's Light, and I don't think Mahoraga would be able to do this for a couple of reasons. Mahoraga doesn't really have a way to do a bunch of damage to Yuta all at once, especially not while Yuta's guard is up. We saw that Mahoraga was able to use his sword and slash Gojo across the chest, and that made him bleed, but even then, the reason that happened is because Gojo's foot got stuck in the shadows and he was caught off guard by Mahoraga. And even though Gojo was cut, he was just able to use reverse curse technique and heal from it like it was nothing. And remember, that slash that he used to take off Gojo's arm, he won't have in this fight with Yuta, because the only reason he was even able to do that is because he was adapting to infinity throughout the fight with Gojo. And as I said at the beginning of the video, Mahoraga won't be able to keep any past adaptations in this fight with Yuta. The reason he was able to use that slash is because he adapted to infinity within that fight, Sukuna versus Gojo. He won't be able to do the same thing here in this fight with Yuta. So I think that even if Mahoraga was able to get up on Yuta and slash him, which I don't think would happen if Yuta were on guard, he would just heal from this, use the Angel's Light, and destroy him anyways. I think that this is the reason why in chapter 234, Yuta said that he would be able to take on Mahoraga and Agito at the same time. Yuta pretty much knew from watching Mahoraga attack that there wasn't really any way that he would be able to kill Yuta while he would have his domain expansion active. And as I said earlier, I think that the only 2 techniques that would be proven useful against Mahoraga if he opened up a domain against him would be Shrine or the Angel's Curse technique. And although it is in the air whether Yuta's Shrine would be able to destroy Mahoraga, I do think that the Angel's Jacob's Ladder would be useful in destroying Mahoraga if it came in contact with him. Now, I did say earlier in the video that I would cover what would happen if Yuta and Mahoraga fought with no domain expansions, and I do just want to say right now, I do think Yuta would win with a domain expansion, but without one, I think Yuta pretty much just loses here. The only way I see Yuta winning without a domain expansion is if he is still able to use the Angel's Curse technique and use it in one go against Mahoraga and destroy him. We know that he is able to apply it to his domain expansion, but without it, we're not sure exactly how he would go about it if he just wanted to use it normally without the use of a domain. And without a domain expansion, even though he is able to use Cleave and Dismantle, just those slashes outside of a domain expansion would not be enough to destroy Mahoraga, just like Sukuna was not able to back when he fought against him. Sukuna felt he needed the use of his full domain expansion, and when that didn't work, he used the fire arrow. So I do think that with no domain expansion, Yuta would probably just lose, since the connection between him and Rika would only last 5 minutes, And we know that without Rika, he does run out of curse energy pretty quickly. And when I say he runs out of curse energy pretty quickly, I mean that we see in the fight with Ryu and Uro, he had to heal from their attacks. And by healing from their attacks, he began to bottom out in terms of curse energy. So in a fight with Mahoraga, assuming that they are hitting each other, he would eventually have to keep healing and he would run out of CE, eventually leading to a situation where he can no longer heal from Mahoraga's attacks and he would eventually lose the fight and die. So I do think that although Mahoraga would win if no domain expansions were involved, unfortunately for Mahoraga, Yuta does have a domain expansion and he would use it in a fight against him. And for all of the reasons that I said earlier, I do think that Yuta would be able to kill Mahoraga, and the fight would not be close. I think Yuta would just be able to open up a domain expansion, use the Angel's Curse technique, destroy him, and pretty much get rid of him without breaking too much of a sweat. And I think that this is the reason why Yuta said earlier while watching the Gojo vs Sukuna fight that he would be able to take on Mahoraga and Agito at the same time. With that being said, I want to thank you so much for reaching the end of the video, and if you enjoyed, then I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.